The Allies mocked Japan's wooden plane until it outsmarted their radar. Section 1. A blip that should not exist. April 12, 1944. 3,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, west of Leyte. The night air hums with vibration as Lieutenant Commander William Harris leans closer to the dim green glow of the radar scope inside the Combat Information Center of USS Hornet. Cigarette smoke hangs low beneath the overhead lights, curling lazily as operators murmur range and bearing reports. Outside, the carrier group cuts through black water at flank speed, destroyer escorts spread wide like sentries guarding the darkness. Harris has been at sea long enough to trust patterns. Japanese aircraft usually appear on radar like ghosts shaped by habit. Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers at medium altitude. A 6M0 fighters skimming low over the waves. The returns are familiar, predictable, almost comforting in their consistency. Then a blip appears that makes him straighten in his chair. It is faint, barely visible, a weak smear of light that flickers, fades, and then reappears several miles closer. It does not move like anything he has seen before. "Check that return," Harris says quietly, his voice steady but tense. The radar operator adjusts the gain. The contact sharpens slightly, but it still looks wrong. Too small, too unstable. It does not bloom on the scope the way metal aircraft usually do. It could be sea clutter, the operator offers, uncertain. Harris shakes his head slowly. The contact is moving too fast for sea clutter, and it is inbound. A chill runs down his spine. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of human sight, something is approaching the fleet, and his radar does not know how to describe it. Across the Pacific, Allied confidence in radar borders on absolute faith. Since 1942, it has been the invisible shield that warns of incoming raids, guides night fighters to their prey, and turns darkness into an Allied advantage. Japanese air attacks, once sudden and terrifying, are now usually detected long before they arrive. Radar works. It always has. Until tonight. Harris orders the contact logged and fighter crews placed on standby. Above them on the flight deck, deckhands pause in their work, feeling the distant vibration of the ship through steel saws. Pilots sit strapped into their cockpits, helmets resting against padded headrests, eyes fixed forward as they wait for a klaxon that may never sound. The blip flickers once more. Then it vanishes entirely. Minutes pass. Nothing happens. Somewhere inside the Combat Information Center, someone releases a nervous laugh. A false alarm, perhaps. Harris exhales slowly, but the unease in his chest does not fade. He records the time and position anyway. Years at sea have taught him that anomalies ignored have a habit of returning with consequences. Thousands of miles away, in a very different kind of workshop, Japanese engineers are building aircraft that few Allied analysts take seriously. By late 1943, American and British intelligence assessments of Japanese aviation have grown dismissive, even openly scornful. Japan, they believe, is running out of aluminum, fuel, and experienced pilots. Reports describe crude designs, desperate improvisations, and unconventional construction methods. Wooden components, glued frames, aircraft that resemble furniture more than weapons of war. In briefing rooms from Pearl Harbor to Washington, the phrase wooden plane is often followed by smirks. Wood, after all, is what one uses when metal is gone, when industry is crippled, when defeat is only a matter of time. What Allied intelligence fails to consider is that wood, under the right conditions, offers something metal cannot: a smaller radar signature. The British have already stumbled upon this truth, though few outside aviation circles fully understand it. The de Havilland Mosquito, introduced in 1941, is constructed largely of plywood and balsa. Fast, agile, and difficult to detect on early radar systems. It has humiliated German air defenses repeatedly over Europe. Yet the Mosquito is seen as a uniquely British achievement, born from exceptional craftsmanship and bold design philosophy. No one expects Japan, battered by blockade and relentless bombing, to arrive at a similar advantage. Inside the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, engineers work under constant pressure. The Imperial Japanese Navy is losing control of the skies. Traditional tactics no longer work. Losses mount faster than pilots can be trained. Fuel is scarce. Strategic materials are even scarcer. Desperation breeds radical thinking. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka is one result of that desperation. A piloted rocket bomb carried beneath a bomber and released near enemy ships. It is designed to be unstoppable in its final dive. Its fuselage incorporates significant wooden elements, partly out of necessity, partly to speed production. It is not designed to evade radar. It is intended to overwhelm defenses through speed and sacrifice. But alongside weapons like the Oka, Japanese designers quietly explore something else. Lightweight aircraft, simplified airframes, wooden structures that can be built quickly, repaired easily, and flown with minimal resources. Some are trainers. Others are experimental interceptors or special attack craft. Their radar signatures, though not fully understood by their creators, are noticeably smaller. By early 1944, Allied radar operators begin reporting strange incidents. Contacts that appear late or flicker unpredictably. Interceptions that fail despite visual sightings. Aircraft that vanish from scopes moments before they should be engaged. Each case is explained away. Equipment malfunction. Operator fatigue. Atmospheric interference. No one connects the dots. Not yet. Back aboard USS Hornet, Harris ends his watch with the uncomfortable feeling that something fundamental has shifted. The Pacific night looks unchanged, but the certainty he once placed in his instruments is gone. Whatever slipped past his radar screen tonight was not supposed to. And if it happened once, it can happen again. Section 2. Laughter in the Briefing Rooms. May 1944. Pearl Harbor Naval Base, Hawaii. Morning light filters through the open shutters of a briefing room overlooking the harbor, casting long bands of white across the polished wooden floor. Ceiling fans turn lazily, stirring warm air heavy with the smell of salt and oil. Rows of officers sit with notebooks open, coffee cups sweating onto official papers stamped secret. On the wall, a naval intelligence officer points at a grainy photograph pinned beside a Pacific map. The image shows a crude-looking aircraft on a dirt airstrip somewhere in the Japanese home islands. Its wings appear oddly smooth, its surface dull and matte rather than reflective. The fuselage lacks the clean metallic lines familiar to American pilots. It looks unfinished, cheap. A few officers exchange glances. One of them chuckles under his breath. The intelligence officer clears his throat. He is Lieutenant Commander Richard Evans, recently transferred from Washington, where he spent months compiling reports on Japanese aviation production. This photograph was obtained through aerial reconnaissance last month. Evans says, it depicts what is believed to be a wooden aircraft under development by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The word wooden hangs in the air. A Navy captain in the second row leans back in his chair, arms folded. Wooden, he repeats, incredulous. What are they building now? Furniture with propellers. A ripple of restrained laughter moves through the room. Evans forces a thin smile. He has heard this reaction before. Sir, Japanese industry is under severe strain. Aluminum shortages are critical. These designs are likely attempts to conserve strategic materials. So they admit they are beaten, another officer says. You do not build wooden airplanes unless you're desperate. Heads nod in agreement. The Pacific War has turned decisively in the Allied favor. Carrier task forces roam freely. Japanese pilot quality has declined sharply. New enemy aircraft, when encountered, are often inferior to American designs. The conclusion feels obvious. Evans clicks to the next image. A schematic drawing, partially reconstructed from intelligence fragments. There is some indication these airframes may have smaller radar cross-sections. The captain snorts. Radar does not care what your airplane is made of. It sees metal, shape, movement, wood, or steel. An airplane is an airplane. Several officers murmur approval. The briefing moves on. Fuel shortages. Pilot training failures. Kamikaze rumors, they're still viewed as exaggerated enemy propaganda. The wooden aircraft slides quietly out of focus, filed away as an academic curiosity rather than a serious threat. What no one in that room fully appreciates is how young radar technology still is. In 1944, radar is powerful, but imperfect. Allied systems are designed and calibrated primarily to detect metal aircraft with predictable profiles. Large bombers, fighters with aluminum skins, objects that reflect radio waves cleanly back to the receiver, would behave differently. Plywood, glue, and fabric absorb portions of the signal. Rounded surfaces scatter reflections. When combined with small size and low altitude flight, detection becomes unreliable. The contact appears weak, unstable, easily lost amid sea clutter or atmospheric noise. The Mosquito has already demonstrated this effect over Europe, slipping through German radar screens to strike Berlin itself. But that lesson remains compartmentalized, confined to British operational experience, and largely misunderstood by American naval planners focused on the Pacific. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Japanese engineers continue their work. At a modest airfield outside Yokosuka, test pilot Lieutenant Junior Grade Misao Tanaka walks slowly around a prototype aircraft resting beneath a camouflage net. Its wooden skin is smooth beneath his fingers, lacquered carefully to protect it from moisture. The aircraft smells faintly of resin and glue rather than oil and metal. Tanaka is not optimistic. He knows the war is turning against Japan. He has lost friends in the Solomons and over the Philippine Sea. He understands that no single aircraft will reverse the tide. But he also knows something else. This airplane does not look like anything the enemy expects. During test flights, ground controllers struggle to track him on Japanese radar. Sometimes his return disappears entirely. Sometimes it flickers like interference. The technicians argue about calibration errors. Tanaka simply flies. The Japanese do not yet understand radar physics well enough to articulate the advantage clearly, but they recognize an effect. Something about these aircraft makes them harder to see. By the summer of 1944, Allied ships across the Pacific begin reporting similar anomalies to the one Lieutenant Commander Harris observed aboard USS Hornet. Faint contacts, delayed warnings, visual sightings without corresponding radar confirmation. In each case, the explanation is mundane. Operator fatigue, faulty equipment, weather interference. No one wants to believe the enemy has found a way around radar. Radar is supposed to be the unbeatable edge, the technological triumph that guarantees early warning and control. Admitting otherwise would mean admitting vulnerability. On the flight decks of American carriers, pilots joke about Japanese wooden planes between missions. Hope they varnish the wings, one says. Would not want them warping in the rain. The laughter is easy, confident, comfortable. But beneath that confidence, something subtle is changing. The Pacific night is no longer as transparent as it once seemed. The radar screens glow just as brightly, the operators just as alert, yet occasionally something slips through the gaps. And when it does, it leaves behind questions that no one is yet prepared to answer. Section 3. The Night the Screens Went Blind. June 19, 1944. Night falls over the Philippine Sea, hours before what history will later name the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, the Combat Information Center hums with focused tension. Radar scopes glow green in the dim light, casting long shadows across the faces of operators hunched over their stations. The air smells of hot electronics and stale coffee. Outside, the sea is calm, deceptively peaceful, a flat black mirror reflecting the stars. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Reynolds, Air Defense Officer for the task force, stands behind the radar table with his hands clasped behind his back. He listens to the steady rhythm of reports. Range, bearing, altitude estimates. Everything sounds normal. Too normal. Reynolds has read the after-action summaries from the past several weeks. The odd contacts, the delayed detections. He does not believe in coincidence. Patterns matter. And tonight, something feels wrong in a way he cannot yet define. At 2,237 hours, a radar operator stiffens. Sir, I have a contact. Bearing 210. Range 40 miles. Reynolds steps closer. The blip is weak, barely visible. It flickers like static. Altitude, he asks. Uncertain, sir. Possibly low. The return keeps fading. Reynolds frowns. Low-altitude contacts are harder to detect, but not this hard. He orders the operator to adjust sensitivity and cross-check with another set. The second scope shows nothing. Minutes pass. The contact drifts closer, then vanishes entirely. Lost contact, the operator says, frustration creeping into his voice. Reynolds exhales slowly. He has no visual confirmation, no consistent track. He cannot scramble fighters based on a ghost. Yet the absence of data feels more dangerous than a confirmed raid. On the flight deck above, night fighters sit idle, engines silent. Pilots stare into the darkness, waiting for orders that do not come. Far beyond the American screen, several Japanese aircraft skim low over the ocean, engines throttled carefully to reduce noise and exhaust flare. Their airframes are light. Their skins are not metal, but layers of wood and fabric sealed with lacquer. They reflect little. They absorb more. One of the pilots, Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Nakamura, keeps his eyes fixed on the horizon. He has been told to fly low, steady, and silent. He does not know why his aircraft has been difficult to track on enemy radar. He only knows that during training flights, American patrols seem to react late, if at all. Tonight, that delay matters. The Japanese aircraft do not attack. They observe. They probe. They turn away before dawn, slipping back into the dark from which they came. Aboard USS Enterprise, Reynolds files his report with careful language. Intermittent, unidentified contact. Possible low-altitude aircraft. No engagement. He chooses his words precisely. He knows how easily such reports are dismissed. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, analysts read dozens of similar entries every week. Most lead nowhere. The war produces noise as well as signal. But some reports refuse to align with existing assumptions. In July 1944, a classified conference convenes at Pearl Harbor to address growing concerns about radar reliability. Naval engineers, intelligence officers, and air defense commanders sit around a long table beneath slowly turning fans. Charts are spread out. Radar logs, interception failures, visual sightings without corresponding detections. An engineer from the Naval Research Laboratory points to a graph showing radar reflectivity tests. Radar performance depends on material, shape, and orientation, he explains. Metal reflects efficiently. Wood does not, especially when combined with curved surfaces and low-altitude flight. A captain interrupts him. Are you suggesting the Japanese have built stealth aircraft? The word stealth draws skeptical looks. No, sir, the engineer replies carefully. Not intentionally, but their use of non-metallic materials may reduce detectability under certain conditions. Another officer scoffs. You're talking about marginal effects. Radar coverage is still effective. The engineer does not argue. He knows better. Technology does not fail dramatically. It fails quietly at the margins until those margins become gaps. Meanwhile, Allied pilots begin noticing something unsettling. Night fighters scramble on radar vectors that lead to empty sky. Searchlights illuminate nothing. Occasionally, a pilot glimpses a dark shape passing below, too late to pursue. Lieutenant James Carter, flying a Grumman F-6F Hellcat on night patrol, reports seeing an aircraft with an unusual silhouette. It looked wrong, he says during debriefing. Too smooth. No shine. It disappeared before I could line up a shot. His report joins a growing stack. The laughter in the briefing rooms fades, replaced by irritation, then concern. Jokes about wooden airplanes are made less often. When they're made, they sound forced. Radar operators begin adjusting procedures. Lower thresholds, more aggressive filtering, increased reliance on visual pickets and air patrols. The system adapts, but adaptation takes time. Time is something the war does not grant freely. By late summer of 1944, Allied commanders acknowledge a quiet truth. Radar is not infallible. It never was. And the enemy, whether by design or desperation, has stumbled upon a way to exploit that fact. The wooden airplanes themselves will not change the outcome of the war. Their numbers are small, their capabilities limited, but the realization they force upon the Allies is profound. Technology does not guarantee safety. Only vigilance does. Section 4. Adapting to the invisible. August 1944. Naval Air Station Barbers Point, Oahu. The afternoon heat presses down on the airfield, shimmering above the concrete runways. Inside a low hangar converted into a temporary briefing hall, rows of radar operators and fighter pilots sit shoulder to shoulder on folding chairs. The mood is different now. No jokes, no casual confidence. What hangs in the air is something closer to professional unease. At the front of the room, Commander Harold Whitman of the United States Navy points to a chalkboard covered in diagrams. Circles represent radar coverage. Thin, broken lines mark contact losses. These gaps are not theoretical, Whitman says. They are real, and the enemy has flown through them. The men in the room listen closely. Many of them have experienced the problem firsthand. Contacts that fade, intercepts that arrive too late, aircraft seen with the naked eye that never appeared on the screen. Whitman continues, "We are not dealing with a miracle weapon. We're dealing with physics. Wood, fabric, glue, smaller airframes, low-altitude approaches. Radar was never designed with this combination in mind." He gestures toward a radar scope set up on a table. That does not mean radar is useless. It means radar must be supported. New procedures are introduced. Radar contacts that appear weak but consistent are no longer ignored. Night fighters are vectored earlier, even on uncertain information. Destroyers are instructed to rely more heavily on visual pickets and sound detection. The system becomes layered, redundant, human and machine working together rather than trusting one instrument alone. The change is subtle, but it matters. Out at sea, Lieutenant Commander William Harris aboard USS Hornet notices the difference almost immediately. Radar operators report faint returns without embarrassment now. Pilots scramble more often, even when the data feels incomplete. The chain of command no longer demands perfect certainty before action. One night in early September, Harris watches a radar trace flicker weakly at the edge of detection. This time, he does not hesitate. "Launch the fighters," he orders. Minutes later, a pair of Hellcats makes visual contact with a small Japanese aircraft flying low and dark against the water. The enemy plane turns away before weapons can be brought to bear, but the message is clear. The Allies are learning. On the Japanese side, the situation is deteriorating rapidly. Fuel shortages worsen. Airfields are cratered by bombing. Production lines are disrupted. Wooden aircraft, once a stopgap solution, become increasingly difficult to maintain as skilled labor disappears and supply lines collapse. Pilots like Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Nakamura sense the shift. Missions become shorter, orders more desperate. The enemy reacts faster now. American fighters appear sooner, guided by improved coordination rather than blind faith in radar screens. During one sortie, Nakamura barely escapes interception, diving into cloud cover as tracer fire flashes past his wing. When he lands, ground crews shake their heads. Another airfield lost. Another squadron relocated. The advantage of invisibility is fading. By October 1944, Allied intelligence assessments have changed tone completely. Wooden aircraft are no longer treated as jokes or curiosities. They are cataloged carefully, their performance analyzed, their limitations understood. Engineers adjust radar frequencies and processing methods. Training manuals are revised. The realization spreads beyond the Pacific. In Europe, British and American planners re-examine their assumptions as well. The Mosquito is no longer just a fast bomber. It is evidence of something deeper. Material choice matters. Shape matters. Detection is never guaranteed. The war continues to reward those who adapt fastest. For the Allies, the lesson arrives in time. The gaps are narrowed. The night grows less forgiving for intruders. Japanese aircraft still slip through occasionally, but rarely without consequence. For Japan, the lesson arrives too late. Innovation born of desperation cannot overcome overwhelming material superiority. Wooden airframes cannot replace fuel. Clever design cannot replace trained pilots. Radar evasion cannot change the balance of industrial power. Yet the impact of those wooden planes lingers. Years later, in post-war studies and quiet technical papers, Allied engineers will revisit the reports from 1944. The faint blips, the missed detections, the laughter that turned to concern. They will recognize them for what they were. Early warnings, not just about one enemy or one war, but about the limits of technology itself. Every system has blind spots. Every advantage invites a counter. Sometimes the most dangerous threat is not the one that announces itself loudly, but the one that barely registers at all. In the Pacific night of 1944, a handful of wooden airplanes proved that truth, not through victory, but through the brief moment when they made the world's most advanced radar screens hesitate. And in war, hesitation is enough. Section 5. The Cost of Learning. November 1944. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Rain sweeps across the anchorage in heavy sheets, drumming against steel decks and turning the sea into a churning gray mass. The war has moved closer to the Japanese home islands, and with it, the intensity of air attacks has increased. Kamikaze strikes now dominate Allied fears, their sudden violence testing every layer of defense. Aboard the escort carrier USS St. Lo, radar operators sit rigid at their stations, eyes locked on scopes that glow steadily in the dim interior. The lessons of the past months weigh heavily on them. Weak contacts are no longer ignored. Every flicker is treated as a potential threat. At 1,050 hours, a faint return appears to the southwest. The operator reports it immediately. The contact is small, unstable, hugging low altitude. The air defense officer hesitates for only a moment before ordering fighters launched and guns manned. Seconds matter now. Out beyond the fleet, a lone Japanese aircraft schemes the waves. Its frame is light, its structure a mixture of wood and metal, built to conserve resources and fly with minimal fuel. The pilot knows his mission. He knows he will not return. The aircraft is spotted visually moments before it is engaged. Anti-aircraft fire erupts from the ships, black bursts tearing the sky apart. Tracers reach out like glowing fingers. The Japanese plane shudders, smoke trailing from one wing, but it does not turn away. It dives. The explosion that follows rocks the carrier, tearing through its flight deck and igniting fuel stores below. Within minutes, fires rage out of control. Despite desperate efforts, USS St. Lo sinks beneath the waves. In the aftermath, investigators comb through radar logs, gun camera footage, eyewitness reports. They trace the timeline second by second. The contact was detected. It was tracked. It was engaged, but it was detected late. Late enough to cost a ship and hundreds of lives. The wooden airframe is not the sole cause. Speed, surprise, and suicidal determination all play their roles. Yet the material choice contributes to the delay, shaving precious seconds from warning times already stretched thin. For Allied commanders, the incident reinforces a grim truth. Adaptation reduces vulnerability, but it does not erase it. No defense is perfect. No lesson learned comes without cost. In response, procedures tighten further. Radar picket ships are pushed farther out, accepting greater risk to provide earlier warning. Fighter direction officers are granted broader authority to launch intercepts without full confirmation. Anti-aircraft crews drill relentlessly, learning to engage faster, react instinctively. Technology evolves as well. Engineers experiment with different radar wavelengths, seeking better detection of small, non-metallic targets. Signal processing techniques improve. Operators are trained to recognize patterns once dismissed as noise. The system grows sharper, but also more complex. Human judgment becomes more critical, not less. On the Japanese side, Losses mount at an unsustainable rate. Wooden aircraft, once seen as a clever adaptation, become symbols of desperation. Their pilots are often barely trained. Their missions increasingly one way. The brief advantage of reduced detectability cannot compensate for overwhelming Allied firepower and experience. Pilots like Hiroshi Nakamura no longer fly reconnaissance or probing missions. They fly with final letters tucked into their uniforms. The invisibility that once offered a slim chance of surprise now only ensures they are seen moments later rather than minutes. Nakamura takes off from a battered airstrip on Luzon one gray morning. Engine sputtering, fuel barely sufficient. He flies low, just as he was taught. He sees the American ships ahead, vast and bristling with guns. This time, fighters are already in the air. He never reaches his target. By the end of 1944, Allied radar coverage across the Pacific is denser and more resilient than ever. The gaps remain, but they are narrower. Wooden aircraft still appear occasionally, but they rarely surprise. The laughter that once echoed in briefing rooms has long since vanished. In its place is respect, not for the effectiveness of the weapon, but for the lesson it delivered. War does not reward complacency. It punishes assumptions. The Allies mocked the idea of wooden airplanes because they believed technology moved in straight lines, from weak to strong, from crude to advanced. The reality is messier. Sometimes progress circles back on itself. Sometimes scarcity forces innovation. Sometimes the unexpected exploits the overlooked. The wooden planes of 1944 did not change the outcome of the war, but they changed how the war was understood. They reminded the men who fought it that superiority is never permanent, and that every advantage carries the seed of its own vulnerability. In the end, the radar screens grew brighter, the procedures tighter, the responses faster. But none of that erased the memory of the moment when the screens went blind and the enemy slipped through, carried not by steel and aluminum, but by wood, glue, and human resolve. Section 6. What the War Quietly Taught. December 1944. Washington, District of Columbia. Snow falls lightly along Constitution Avenue, softening the sharp lines of government buildings and muffling the city in an unusual stillness. Inside a secure conference room deep within the Navy Department, the war feels anything but quiet. Maps cover the walls. Technical charts lie spread across a long table. The men gathered here are not frontline commanders, but engineers, analysts, and senior officers tasked with understanding what the war has revealed rather than how to fight it tomorrow. Rear Admiral Samuel Richards stands at the head of the table, hands resting on a folder stamped top secret. He looks tired. Everyone in the room does. The war has forced them to rethink assumptions that once felt unshakable. Richards opens the folder and begins. Gentlemen, what we are reviewing today is not a failure of courage or effort. It is a failure of expectation. He gestures toward a chart showing radar detection ranges plotted against aircraft materials and profiles. Lines that once looked clean and reassuring now show irregular gaps. For years, Richards continues, we believed radar provided certainty. Early warning, control, superiority. The events of this year have demonstrated that radar provides probability, not certainty. No one interrupts him. A civilian scientist from the Naval Research Laboratory clears his throat. The Japanese did not invent a new science, he says carefully. They exploited an old one. Radio waves interact differently with wood, fabric, and adhesive compounds than they do with metal. The effect is not absolute invisibility, but reduced detectability under specific conditions. An Army Air Force's liaison officer nods. And those conditions existed at sea. Low altitude, background clutter, night operations. The room absorbs this quietly. What troubles them most is not what Japan accomplished, but how easily it was overlooked. The Mosquito had already proven many of these principles in Europe. Yet institutional confidence, reinforced by success, had dulled curiosity. In wartime, success can be as dangerous as failure. Across the Pacific, the war grinds toward its conclusion. Japanese wooden aircraft appear less frequently now, their numbers dwindling as airfields fall and fuel disappears. When they do appear, they are usually detected, intercepted, destroyed. The tactical problem has been solved. The strategic lesson remains. On Okinawa in early 1945, radar operators work with an intensity born of hard experience. They trust their screens, but they trust their instincts as well. When something feels wrong, they act. When a contact looks weak but persistent, they report it. Fighters launch. Guns track. The system no longer relies on perfection. Lieutenant Commander William Harris, now promoted and reassigned, reflects on the change during a rare, quiet evening. He remembers the night in April when the blip appeared and vanished. At the time, it felt like an error. Now, he understands it was a warning, not of defeat, but of complacency. The war will end months later with forces far beyond radar and wooden airplanes. Atomic fire will close the conflict in a way no one in this room can yet imagine. But the quieter lessons will endure longer than the louder ones. After the war, American engineers will study radar evasion deliberately. They will revisit material science, shape, absorption, scattering. Ideas once encountered accidentally will become intentional design goals. Future aircraft will not be built of wood, but they will seek the same effect. Reduced detection, delayed warning, confusion in the enemy defense network. The wooden airplanes of Japan will occupy only a footnote in most history books. A curiosity, a desperation measure, a failed experiment. Yet among those who watched radar screens flicker in the Pacific night, they will be remembered differently. As the moment's certainty cracked, as a reminder that war is not only a contest of strength, but of perception, of assumptions, of the willingness to question what seems proven. The Allies won the war because they adapted faster, learned faster, and accepted uncomfortable truths sooner than their enemies. The wooden planes did not defeat them, but they forced them to listen, to look closer, and to understand that even the strongest shield has thin places. In the end, radar did not fail. Human belief in its infallibility did. Section 7. The moment the joke died. January 1945. Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Maryland. Cold wind sweeps across the frozen tarmac as a small group of officers and civilian engineers stand beside an aircraft that looks strangely out of place. Its shape is familiar, yet unsettling. Smooth surfaces, rounded edges, minimal protrusions. No exposed metal skin shimmering in the winter sun. This is not a Japanese airplane. It is American. The aircraft before them is an experimental test platform, built not for combat, but for understanding. Sections of its structure incorporate wood composites and non-metallic panels. Its purpose is simple and unsettling: to determine just how much the enemy had unknowingly revealed. Commander Edward Lawson, formerly a fighter director in the Pacific, watches as technicians make final adjustments. He remembers the jokes. He remembers the laughter in briefing rooms when wooden airplanes were mentioned. He does not laugh now. The engines start. The aircraft taxis forward. Radar operators inside a nearby test facility begin tracking, or try to. On the scope, the return is weak, unstable. At certain angles, it nearly vanishes. No one speaks. This is the moment the joke finally dies. The engineers exchange glances, not triumphant, but sober. What the Japanese stumbled upon through desperation, the Allies now see clearly through science. Material choice alone is not decisive, but when combined with shape, altitude, and operational discipline, it can bend the rules of detection. The implications stretch far beyond the Pacific War. Lawson thinks back to the first time he dismissed a radar operator report as clutter. He remembers the mild irritation, the confidence that the system worked because it always had. He understands now how dangerous that mindset was. War does not announce its lessons politely. By early 1945, these realizations circulate quietly through classified channels. There is no public acknowledgement, no dramatic declaration. The war is still being fought, and there is no room for academic celebration. But internally, doctrine begins to shift. Radar is redefined not as a shield, but as a sensor, one input among many. Visual observation regains importance. Human judgment is elevated rather than suppressed. Redundancy becomes doctrine rather than insurance. The Pacific War grinds on through Okinawa and beyond. Kamikaze attacks remain deadly, but increasingly they are met with layered defenses shaped by hard experience. Wooden airframes no longer surprise. They are anticipated. Pilots who once laughed now scan the sea more carefully. Radar operators who once doubted their instincts now trust them. The cost of learning has been paid. When Japan finally surrenders in August 1945, the wooden airplanes fade quickly from public memory. They do not fit the narrative of overwhelming industrial power and technological supremacy that defines Allied victory. They are inconvenient reminders that the enemy, even when losing, can still think. In post-war interrogations, Japanese engineers speak openly. There was no master plan to defeat radar. No secret doctrine of invisibility. There was scarcity, shortage, necessity. Wood was used because metal was gone. Low-altitude flight was chosen because fuel was limited and survival demanded it. The advantage was accidental. That fact troubles Allied analysts more than any deliberate strategy could have, because it means the blind spot was always there. It only required the right conditions to reveal it. In later years, as jet aircraft replace propellers and radar systems grow more sophisticated, the lesson endures quietly beneath layers of progress. Detection is never absolute. Every sensor has assumptions. Every assumption can be challenged. The wooden airplanes of Japan did not win battles. They did not change the outcome of the war, but they cracked a certainty that needed to be broken. They reminded the victors that intelligence is not only about what the enemy can do, but about what you believe they cannot. For men like William Harris, Thomas Reynolds, and Edward Lawson, that lesson remains personal. It lives in the memory of faint blips, missed intercepts, and the moment confidence gave way to doubt. In war, doubt is not weakness. It is the beginning of understanding. Section 8. After the silence. September 1945. The Pacific War is over. The ocean is calmer now, at least on the surface. Warships lie at anchor rather than racing through the dark. Radar rooms that once pulsed with tension now operate at routine tempo, tracking weather fronts and friendly traffic instead of incoming raids. The constant edge of expectation has dulled, replaced by exhaustion and reflection. On a quiet afternoon aboard a demobilizing carrier in San Diego Bay, Lieutenant Commander William Harris stands alone inside the Combat Information Center. The lights are brighter than he remembers. The scope's cleaner. The room feels almost sterile without the pressure that once defined every second inside it. A junior officer asks him why he is still staring at the radar screen. Harris pauses before answering. Because this is where the war surprised us, he says finally. In the months since surrender, reports are being written, filed, classified, and quietly circulated. Lessons learned, mistakes acknowledged, not for newspapers or public speeches, but for future officers who will one day stand watch in similar rooms. Among those lessons is a simple sentence that appears again and again in different forms. No system is complete on its own. Radar won the war in the air, many will say, and that is mostly true, but those who were there know the truth is more fragile. Radar worked because men learned when to trust it and when to question it, because weak signals were no longer dismissed, because laughter gave way to caution. The wooden airplanes are discussed in technical appendices and footnotes. They are analyzed dispassionately now. Radar cross-section measurements, material absorption curves, flight profiles correlated against detection probability. They're no longer embarrassing anomalies. They're data. At Patuxent River and other test facilities, engineers continue flying unconventional airframes. Some use composite materials. Others focus on shape alone. What began as an attempt to understand the enemy becomes a blueprint for the future. Quietly, deliberately, a new idea takes form. Detection can be managed, not eliminated, not defeated, but influenced. Years later, When sleek aircraft appear that seem to melt into the sky, historians will trace their lineage back through layers of theory and experimentation. Few will mention the Pacific War. Fewer still will mention Japanese wooden airplanes. But the connection is there. Innovation rarely arrives fully formed. Sometimes it limps onto the battlefield, imperfect and misunderstood, carried by necessity rather than vision. Sometimes it fails tactically but succeeds intellectually. The men who mocked the wooden planes never intended to be careless. They were confident because confidence had been earned. The Allies dominated the air through skill, numbers, and technology. But dominance can narrow vision as easily as it strengthens resolve. That is the quiet danger victory brings. In personal journals and late-night conversations, veterans remember the shift in tone. The moment jokes stopped. The moment faint radar returns began to matter. The moment when technology stopped being magic and became a tool again. Those moments do not appear in victory parades. They appear in memory. For Japanese engineers and pilots who survived, the wooden airplanes become symbols of a lost cause. Not because they were foolish, but because they were too late. Innovation without resources cannot sustain a war. Cleverness cannot replace fuel, pilots, and time. Yet, even in defeat, they left behind an unintended legacy. They reminded their enemy that certainty is fragile, that sometimes the most dangerous thing in war is not the weapon you fear, but the one you dismiss. As the sun sets over San Diego Bay, Harris turns away from the radar screen for the last time. The green glow fades behind him. The war is over. The lesson remains. Technology will always advance. Systems will grow faster, sharper, more precise. But somewhere in every design, there will be an assumption. And somewhere else, someone desperate enough may find a way around it. That is what the wooden planes proved. Not that Japan could outsmart the Allies, but that no one is ever finished learning.